So let's go ahead and get this started. So first, it is my pleasure to welcome our audience and speakers to today's Alumni Speaker Series session. Welcome, everybody. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Just to let you know that today's session is being recorded and will be available on YouTube for viewing later. And a link to the recording will also be sent out after the session in the coming days. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A section. So if you want to orient yourself quickly to where the Q&A is at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will answer as many of them as possible as the event progresses. And also one more thing before we get started and introduce the speakers, I'd like to take a moment to publicly acknowledge the traditional territory upon which we live and work, as it is an important step toward reconciliation. So the University of Waterloo acknowledges that much of our work takes place on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and it is centralized within the Office of Indigenous Relations. As we are likely calling in from different locations across Canada and the world, I also wish to acknowledge the Indigenous communities globally that have lived and continue to live in harmony with nature. I wish to recognize the innovations that came before us and appreciate the sustainability principles that Indigenous communities have lived by. I'd like to sort of set the stage here for the discussion, but first I'll introduce myself before turning the floor and introducing our panelists to get it started. So before I introduce our esteemed experts on our panel today, let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name's Nadine Ibrahim, and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Waterloo, and I hold the Turkstra Chair in Urban Engineering. In this leadership role as the Turkstra Chair in Urban Engineering, my overall vision is to build a community of practice of leaders in municipal engineering to offer leadership for our future cities. And in my research and teaching, I combine civil engineering with other disciplines, predominantly environmental engineering, and try to incorporate non-engineering fields like architecture, economics, and governance. I am honored today and excited to be your moderator for today's Alumni Speaker Series session, hosting panelists with a diverse background, but each with a unique mission of addressing several challenges that many cities face today as we attempt to design our cities for 50 or 100 years into the future. Today, our panel of experts will dissect the role that engineers play as public leaders, visionaries, and political influencers as we replace aging infrastructure with modes and nodes that support population growth for our flourishing planet. So to pique your interest, our panelists will provoke your thoughts and with transformational, not incremental change that is needed today. If we are to really take on the climate crisis head on. So this promises to be engaging, educational, and entertaining. We have 3 panel speakers for today's session who I know very well, and they know each other very well, and they are. First, Jeff Casello is a professor jointly appointed in the School of Planning and the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Jeff's primary research interest is in the development and application of quantitative models of transportation system performance. Jeff is also the lead researcher in the Waterloo Public Transportation Initiative, which is a University of Waterloo research group that provides expertise in urban transportation planning and engineering in order to address the challenges relevant to Canadian and global cities. So you can do a little wave, Jeff. And next, Joanna Curvin is an alumna of the University of Waterloo as she graduated from the civil engineering program in 1986. Today, she is the Vice President, External Approvals and Implementation at Crosslinks Transit Solutions, where she's working to deliver the $5.3 billion Eglinton Crosstown LRT project in Toronto. She leads a team responsible for a broad range of technical stakeholder issues across the project. And Joanna, wave. to everybody. There we go. And Michael Murray is currently a consultant at Murray Advisory Services, his consulting firm. Mike is a senior executive with extensive public, private, and not-for-profit sector experience, including significant leadership roles in municipal government. So he will be bringing a diverse perspective on today's topic. If you're from Kitchener or Waterloo, you may recognize his name as he was instrumental in bringing the LRT to the region of Waterloo. And if you'd like to see the full biographies, thanks, there we go, Mike, wave. To see the full biographies of our panel speakers, you can visit our events page, and we'll put the link to the event page in the chat so that you could access it throughout the session. All right, we're ready to get started. Welcome to our speakers and our audience, and let's jump right into it. We're going to start our conversation today by laying the groundwork for understanding the current state of urban engineering in many of our cities and the challenges that engineers, political leaders, and urban planners are facing today. So, in other words, we need to know where we're at so that we can find direction and where to go from here. And as we tell our engineering students, we need to spend more time defining the problems before we can create innovative and creative solutions that actually address the problems. So let me start with questions to each of you. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you. So speaking from your academic lens, where is the research pointing from the engineering or the planning side? And what are the key findings for our transportation infrastructure or mobility currently?
Yeah, thanks, Nadine, and thanks everyone for joining. This is really fantastic. So I thought about this question. I think we should start with the premise that really we've known, I think our current pattern of development in North America is really not good for us. We've known that since about 1970. So we've been working under the impression that we should try to be different in our land use and mobility patterns for the last 50 years. And I think we've seen cities evolve in very different ways. You can look at Kitchener-Waterloo, you can look at other cities in Ontario, you can look at Toronto and the edges and so on. You'll see very different patterns. And maybe you go as far afield as Buffalo or Cleveland, and you see very different urban areas. And so as academics, what we focused on for this period is, I guess, a few things. There's been a lot of effort directed at new technologies, particularly vehicle technologies. We are now talking always about electric vehicles and electrification of our infrastructure as a way to solve our sustainability problems. And I think as the day goes on, people will hear me argue that that's really a very marginal and incremental change, and probably, if you look very closely, isn't going to get us to where we need to be. On the planning side of the house, we've spent a lot of time thinking about our land use patterns. So what actually should we be doing when we think about where to locate our businesses, where to locate our homes, where to locate our social and cultural activities? And I think a lot of that is trying to move us to a place where people have the option to walk and to cycle and to use public transit. And I think we've seen different levels of success in achieving those kinds of goals. And right now, the research continues to ask the questions about how do we implement land use changes and really try to affect behavioral changes. And I think what's really the biggest gap that's missing from a research perspective that I want to spend a bit of time on today is really understanding human behavior and what motivates people to act in a certain way, what motivates people to choose a vehicle when they're purchasing it or not to choose a vehicle, what motivates people to decide where to live and where to work, and what are those factors that we as a public sector group can do to actually influence that kind of human behavior? Because ultimately, we can do as much as we want on technology, we can do as much as we want on setting policy, but if we're not actually influencing the individual actors, the people, the firms, the communities, then we're not going to achieve the sustainability objectives. So happy to talk some more about that as the day goes on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. And sometimes it's either the research that leads the practice or the practice leading the research. We'll find out. Mike, I'd like to go to you next and tapping into your private sector perspective. Where is the industry at in terms of the state?
Joanna.
Sorry. I'm going to rephrase that. Yes, Joanna, my apologies. I'm going to tap into your private sector view and ask you where the industry is at in terms of the state of infrastructure and where is the focus at the moment.
So certainly from the private sector, I'm with a contracting consortium. A great deal of our time and effort is going into obviously building these big infrastructure projects, working with governments to renew infrastructure that's been in the ground for a very long time. You know, in Toronto, certainly there's a lot of Toronto water infrastructure that is being renewed, but certainly without question, the big focus is on transit. And that's critical infrastructure for the evolution of our cities and the transformation of our cities. And certainly I'm working on one of the most transformational projects I think the city will see in a very long time to come, other than perhaps the Ontario line. But in addition to actually doing the work and getting the contracts and doing the building and design, one of the things that we are in parallel doing is we're advising government on what contracting structures work, what works, what doesn't. My role, because I'm doing a lot of external approvals, my role is often advising cities and approval agencies to adapt their processes and adapt their governance structures to really support these large projects. So a great deal of my time is spent working with cities and negotiating new ways of doing business. And that's only going to help other projects down the line. And it certainly also helps government. It helps provincial governments really understand what works and what doesn't work. We're also working with cities to advance some of their design standards to suit these big public transit projects. So again, we're trying to lead by example and lead by influencing, as opposed to, you know, meeting specific design standards. We're trying to lead the field and really benefit everybody else who comes after us.
Wonderful, thank you, Joanna. And Mike, last but not least, from your public sector perspective, what is the appetite at the moment for transportation, and what are people's inclinations and communities' preferences today?
Yeah, well, thanks, Nadine, and yeah, thanks to everybody who's logged into this. Yeah, I'm going to speak mostly from a public sector municipal perspective, and probably mostly from a Southern Ontario, Greater Golden Horseshoe perspective, sort of the GTA, Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, Guelph area. Because circumstances differ across the country. So most of my comments will focus on kind of that geographic area. So I would say a couple things. I'm going to talk first about in general, and then I'm actually going to come back and make a few comments that would be different today than 20 months ago, because the pandemic has actually changed a little bit of people's thinking. But pre-pandemic, you know, one of the themes that Jeff and Joanna mentioned is change. And I think a growing acknowledgement that we need to do things differently. One of the things that's going to drive that for sure municipal governments are realizing, provincial government and to some extent federal government, this area is growing rapidly. This is probably one of the fastest growing parts of the country. Waterloo region, which I'm most familiar with, projected to grow to about 900,000 people over the next 20 or 30 years. Toronto, it's going to add a couple million people, right? So then you get people really focused on how are we going to accommodate that? Where are all these people going to live, and how are all these people going to get around? And I think a growing recognition that the status quo, same old, is not going to serve us well. So that I think is there's an appetite for change. However, I think what residents want most is convenience. Yeah. So when they think about change, they want it to be convenient. So if we talk about active transportation, cycling and walking, they want it to feel comfortable and safe and convenient. If we talk about transit, more transit within cities, which is for sure part of the recipe, and better transit between cities, people want it to be convenient. So they want fast service, reliable service, frequent service. I'll just take an example. Waterloo region, there's GO train service between Waterloo region and Toronto. It is slow. It's about a 2-hour plus trip. Think about if that trip was an hour. that would be transformational. So I think there's a great appetite for people to embrace new approaches, but it kind of has to work for them. So that's one big comment I would make. The other, just reflect on the last 20 months and what that's taught us is a couple of things. People are getting around differently. More work from home. So that's relieved a little bit of the stress on our transportation networks. And I think overall, COVID has bought us a little bit of time. I think we're gradually going to see, we're seeing it already, car traffic coming back. COVID has impacted public transit ridership dramatically. People aren't comfortable getting on a crowded bus or subway. But that will come back gradually also. But COVID has bought us a bit of time to get some of these solutions in place. It's also taught us that when we need to change, we can do it really quickly if collectively we turn our minds to it. So there's a couple of comments on current state.
Wonderful, yeah, and thanks for offering these perspectives to get the landscape sort of known before we jump into the word change, which each one of you have actually said as part of your response to getting us familiar with the landscape at the moment. We do have a couple of questions, and now's a good time to take them before we jump into our next section. So let me do that. And they go back to laying that foundational understanding. So, the title of the session today is Reimagining Cities, Why Your Grandkids Won't Drive and Other Ways Engineers Will Save Humanity. So here's a question from the audience. When he was a child, he was told that our cars would also be airplanes by this era. Will our kids really not drive, or is this also a pipe dream? I will let any of you take on this question if you'd like. Yes, Jeff.
I love this question. I think that when we were focusing on our cars being airplane and solving two-dimensional congestion by going to a third dimension, we didn't consider all the energy consumption associated with traveling in third dimensions. So to travel at elevation, of course, takes an order of magnitude more energy than it does to travel on the ground. So that thought occurred in a time when we had no idea about carbon or no idea about the energy consumption. Is it a reality that the next generation won't drive? I mean, I think there's already evidence that we're moving that way. Kids aren't getting their driver's license the way that any of our panelists probably did get their driver's license because it's not nearly as important. And I think if we create our cities and we create our transport structures in the right way, it's a very real outcome that far fewer of our children and our grandchildren will drive than what this generation is. But it will take transformative change, and we'll talk about some ideas later.
Having said that, 50 to 100 years hence, may we see, using the third dimension? I actually think that's in the realm of possibility. And, they're already looking at, electric powered or battery powered airplanes, trying to get away from the carbon issues. And, I think one of the things we do run up against is all the conflicts in a two-dimensional world. For space, just space on the surface. So I actually think, 50, 100 years hence, we could see more use of either above ground or below ground transportation.
Something that I think Mike really touched on was convenience. And I think in order for the next generation or 2 generations from now to really not need to drive is really, for me, the critical piece of this. Is not needing to drive means that we have a lot of options for travel. And that may well come in the form of automated vehicles that provide that last kilometer to transit and having plenty of transit options available to the average person for all of their types of trips, not just home to work, because really that's what we've been focused on, is home to work kind of travel. We need to make it convenient for a lot of other kinds of travel. And we also need to get our kids engaged in not using vehicles. And, I have 3 sons, they're all in their 20s, and they None of them got their driver's licenses when they were teenagers. They've all gotten them in their 20s, but they still have that foundation of using transit. And that's a good thing to me, is making sure that they also have that experience of public transit, that public transit actually is a good thing, but there are going to be limitations until we can make it more convenient.
Thank you. Having options is always a positive and makes life a lot more flexible, which is a great segue into where I'd like to take this conversation next, which is into the challenges and the changes that are possible. It's really tapping into our current challenges, the problems yet to be solved, looking into some of the personal or behavioral change, organizational change at the city level or change at the global level, or even challenges that we have not yet encountered. Who would have known the pandemic would have been something that we would be facing? So we've set the scene in the past few minutes, and now we're going to shift into talking about the change necessary to improve urbanization in the future and the challenges we face to design our cities 50 years to 100 years into the future. And as we design our cities into the future, the electrification of mass transit, the reimagining of public space is the low-hanging fruit to sustainability. Or the question is, or is it the low-hanging fruit to sustainability? So this sort of the responses I'm looking for is probably not going to follow the proverb, little by little, a little becomes a lot, but rather it's the kind of transformational change that you have all been so bold to bring to your cities yourselves. So this time around, Joanna, I'd like to start with you, with your experience in public transit and how familiar you are to really ripping a city apart, ripping it open to make room for this transformational change like new transit lines. Could you please reflect on why our grandkids won't drive?
Well, this is a really big question. I had to spend quite a bit of time really sort of thinking about it. We're really just getting started. Honestly, you know, when I look at the Eglinton Crosstown, I was working on that project in the Let's Move program back in the 1980s when I came out of school. This project was the top of the list. So we're pretty far behind as far as transit expansion goes. So we can't stop here. I mean, this is really just phase one as far as I'm concerned. And we'll take more bold action from government to really start funding more of these big transit corridors outside of the city that will start the transformation of cities and building communities around these new transit corridors. But beyond that, though, it's not just about transit corridors. It's just about how do we use our transportation corridors, what we call roads, how do we use them better? And honestly, you know, to Mike's point about the pandemic, we've seen some pretty bold experiments that have been done as a result of the pandemic in Toronto, where we're seeing huge numbers of lanes being transformed into bike lanes, protected bike lanes. We're seeing Cafe TO, which is using up, parking lanes for street cafes. We need a lot more of these bold actions that don't take 2 years of debate at councils in order to get them enacted, because we can't afford to be wasting a lot of time in debate over this. So these are some really bold things. And I certainly hope that the Toronto experience can really broaden out and be used as an impetus for a lot of other communities. And of course, the new technology is really going to give us options for that last kilometer, last mile for local transit, where we've got automated electric shuttles. We've already got them starting testing at Whitby GO Station. That's amazing. In another generation, that's going to be the norm. We're going to have these local little shuttles being available for people to do that last bit of travel. Enhancing our public, our walking space, absolutely critical to making alternative choices for transportation. But I really thought, well, what does that mean on the ground? Because like I'm building a project that was designed 5 years ago. How can that be adapted? How can we adapt our communities to embrace some of this autonomous vehicle technology? Well, we could actually have car ownership dropping and having fleets of autonomous vehicles circulating in our neighborhoods to take people to the nearest transit station, transit stop. Existing parking lots in, say, underground condos or office buildings could be used to house those when they're not in use and recharge them. So we're not needing to own a vehicle. There are vehicles just out there for our use. And bringing bike fleets out to neighborhoods. As we continue to expand all of our biking infrastructure, we've just started with the bike fleet concept, in some of our communities. So all of these things really leads me to believe that we are headed in the right direction, but we need to still, embrace the bold change. And one of the impediments, and I will tell you this because I've dealt with it for the last 20 years, being both in government and both in the private sector, is fair integration. And nobody wants to talk about it, certainly not in the Toronto area, because it's a very, very hard political issue to tackle. But if we're going to allow all this flexibility, we're going to have all these different services to offer, we need to have easy ways to pay fares and easy ways to not get stuck, being double or triple charged based on our trips. So there's a lot of political challenge with that. But I think it's doable. I think we've proven that we can adapt quickly with the pandemic. We just need to keep that mindset going.
Joanna, I think you did actually prove it doable because you made reference to your kids, not even your grandkids. So it may be sooner than we actually imagined. So thanks for that. I want to tackle a different part of the title of this session, which is the climate crisis. So Jeff, maybe I'll share this with you. So as a faculty member who is cross-appointed in both planning and engineering, you have these two faculty perspectives and potentially also double the impact when addressing the climate crisis. So how are we going to tackle the climate crisis?
A lot of responsibility, Nadine.
No pressure.
Super question. Here's what I think. When we think about the climate crisis from the planning perspective, we're often thinking about this situation from sort of societal and communal kinds of perceptions. And so what's happening in our communities and how much carbon is being produced and how much energy and so on and that kind of question. And then you think about it from the engineering perspective, and we think a lot about supply of energy, and we think about ways that we can reduce the carbon footprint associated with the supply of our energy. And it's really at the intersection of these two things that I think we begin to really be able to address the climate crisis. And I'll tell you what I mean. If we had a way in which every decision that we as actors made was based, at least in part, on the carbon intensity of the behavior that we were about to engage in, we would behave very differently. There's an economic concept that we talk about called an externality. And the externality means that when I behave in a certain way, I impact society or community or the environment in ways that they may not accept. But I don't perceive that because I'm not the one that gets influenced. So when I drive down the street in my high energy and intensive vehicle and I'm producing lots of emissions, that's an externality that I don't pay for. When I make lots of noise on my motorcycle, which I don't do, but some do, there's another externality that we don't pay for. And when we build a single family detached house in a previously undeveloped greenfield area, there's lots of externalities that are associated with that kind of development. And so if we can get better with the supply of how we create the energy, but we get better also on the consumption side, and we do that by getting the prices right, getting the economics right associated with our carbon intensity. Every morning I have a choice to get up and drive in my private auto and come to the university and park in a parking spot that's already paid for. And I pay for it, but it's already paid for. And I could have that absolute convenience to control the radio, the temperature, everything, the route, the path. If there's congestion, I can change. Or the alternatives that I can get on public transport and be dictated by the public transport schedule and have delays that are beyond my control and have a walk on either end. And I have to make a choice about what I do there. Now, I have a value system that leads me to the public transit system, but for rational behaviors, that car is more convenient than that public transport behavior. But if we were to price the carbon associated with that travel by car versus this carbon associated with the LRT system, people might behave differently. At least they would have the motivation to think through that. And I think the intersection of these two things, of the energy supply, the energy production, and the human behavior that is at the nexus of those two things, is how we're going to control climate change. And people tell me that I'm a social engineer, that I'm trying to be the puppet. And you know what? They're right. Like, I think we should just get the decision so that people are acting and behaving in rational ways with all the information available to themselves. And so that's what I really think is the pathway to the climate crisis, is getting the information in front of people so they can make a really good decision. I'll just give one more quick example. If an Uber picks up a person on top of the Young University Spadina subway, there should be a $30 surcharge for getting in that car on top of the Young University Spadina line, because you can use the train that is directly below you to travel with zero carbon footprint virtually, or you get into a single passenger vehicle with Uber and it drives you directly to your destination. That convenience is fantastic, but you should pay the social cost associated with that travel. So there you have it, Nadine. I'm sure that that's unpopular and bold. So let's hope that Matt met the goals of the conversation today.
Absolutely. You are an engineer that speaks human. So that's awesome. Mike, again, tapping into another part of the title of the session, which is really speaking to how we can really save humanity. So this is upping the game a little from the climate crisis. And you've served many years in public service, and you've seen generations upon generations influenced by public policy decisions and infrastructure projects in cities. So the bold question for you here is, how will engineers save humanity?
Right. I knew you were going to ask this question, and that is even bigger question than the climate crisis and Joanna's. So I'll tackle it. I'm going to start with saying a couple things how engineers won't save humanity. And one way they won't is by working by themselves and just working with other engineers. Another way they won't, and Jeff and Joanna both alluded to this, they won't do it by tweaking the status quo. The way that engineers will help save humanity will be by being innovative, creative, thinking big, thinking bold, and trying things. So let me just expand on that a little bit. So some of the things that I think engineers will do that will help save humanity is work closely with other disciplines. And in particular, transportation engineers working closely with land use planners, because we need to reimagine where and how we live. We need to reimagine our cities, because that will influence the type and number and length of trips that we need to take. And back to the whole convenience factor. If people are living and working in closer proximity, if it's possible, and it's not for everybody, but if it's possible, then that reduces the number of trips. So engineers working with land use planners, with public policy experts, with finance experts. Think about the fare integration issue. Well, you know what? Here's a big, bold thing that engineers could explore with other experts. What if we made transit free? What if it was paid for through people's taxes, like the road system is, absent a few toll roads? There would be a big, bold thing that would solve the fare integration issue and remove some barriers. So that's the kind of thing so engineers, I think, working with planners, finance experts, public policy people, politicians, to explore a whole range of solutions. The other thing, another way that I think engineers will help save humanity is focusing a little bit more on better defining the problems that we as engineers are trying to solve. So transportation engineers for years often defined the problem as how can we move more cars? How can we move more cars faster, better, more efficiently? Well, you know what? It's how do we move people? How do we move people? So that's just reframing the problem definition that I think will help engineers, save humanity. And I'll say one or two other things. Another way that I think engineers will help save humanity is a little bit less focus on building things, I mean, that attracts engineers to the profession, right? It's the people who like to build things, right? And so that's the kind of solution that we jump to. And, you know, I love building transit systems, so that's cool. But we've built a lot of roads over the last number of decades. But what if instead of focused on building things, we're focused on really solving problems and being open to a whole range of structural and non-structural solutions? You know, some of the, you know, behavioral change kind of triggers that Jeff talked about, pricing triggers, making free transit, parking issues. So those are all, you know, non-structural, they don't involve building things, but they can help solve the problem if we define it properly. But to do that, I think engineers have to work closely with lots of other people. So maybe I'll stop there. Yeah.
Oh, you've certainly.
Can I just add one really quick thing about the engineers, just on the last thing that Mike was saying? What engineers are really good at are understanding probabilities and likelihoods and modeling those kinds of things and creating estimates of behavior. And I think that this is something that our engineering curricula really have to work at to embed in this, that engineers, there's not a best answer. There's a series of answers and all of them have a likelihood of an outcome. And if we can really be good at that, that's a role that engineers can play in creating better futures for all of us.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for having you know, the courage to tackle the bigger questions. And in your responses, you've tapped a little bit into what the future might look like. So I know there's a lot of questions coming through. Let's get to this last section before opening it up for questions. And it's really trying to end on a high note by really taking a future outlook on this. And so reflecting on the changes that we just explored, there comes a huge opportunity for leadership at many levels. And you're not only pointing to engineers, but you're also pointing to political leaders and influencers and planners, et cetera. And I'd like to add a quote here. Leadership is not driving the train, it's laying the track, which speaks to leadership. And funnily enough, it is from a transportation angle. And this was actually credited to Edwin Catmull, who's the president of Walt Disney Animation Studios. So I'd like you to tell us your thoughts on what's considered a bold move, something that's necessary, but perhaps a publicly unpopular opinion, like the $30 surcharge on the Uber. And how does this help us improve urban planning or urban engineering or urban design in regards to sort of from that transportation perspective? So let me switch around the order. Mike, I'll start with you. Could you answer this question, sort of that necessary but perhaps unpopular opinion from a municipal perspective?
Yep. Yeah, and you know, lots of things that municipalities do are unpopular. And you know, I spent about almost 30 years working in municipal government, and so I got kind of scars to prove it. So I'm gonna talk about a couple of things that go back to what I was saying earlier about the critical importance of integrating land use planning and transportation infrastructure. So a couple of things that, you know, they're not necessarily bold or as bold as I would like, but they're necessary and sometimes unpopular. So one is a continued focus on intensification and reshaping, you know, how our cities are built. So, you know, really finding all of the tools to encourage more growth inward and upward rather than outward. And, you know, looking at land use planning policies, financial incentives, other public policy measures that will encourage intensification. And for some people, that is popular. For other people, it's not. You know, some people hold on to the dream that, you know, I'm owed a single family dwelling in the suburb with, you know, my frontage and my lot and all of that. So first, you know, I think some people embrace that. Other people are looking for other alternatives and you know, are excited about intensification and being able to live in a downtown urban environment at all stages of their lives. So I think it's important, the intensification, unpopular in some fronts, certainly unpopular with greenfield developers who actually in this province wield a disproportionate amount of political influence. And you know, that is something I would encourage everybody to keep your eye on, the influence that greenfield developers wield on transportation decisions, some that are playing out as we speak. So that's one. The second is continuing to build more and better public transit, both within cities and between cities. So within cities, you know, Joanna's working on a big project. We did one in Waterloo region, building light rail transit or subways. They are intensely disruptive. So there is a lot of short-term pain on residents and businesses that will for sure produce long-term gain. But it's really helping the whole community get through that short-term pain period because it can be pretty unpopular. So that's within cities. Between cities, especially in Southern Ontario, I think there's a huge opportunity for high-speed rail. You look at many, many other parts of the world, you can take high-speed train, you know, between cities that are 50, 80, 100 kilometers apart. That would be transformational in Southern Ontario. You know, from say London, Kitchener-Waterloo, Toronto, you know, Ottawa, those kinds of things. It's been studied over and over again. The plans exist. It's unpopular in some areas because it's disruptive in rural areas. It's disruptive to rural residents whose, you know, roads might get cut off by high-speed rail. It's disruptive to farmers along the route. So I think what we need to find as a society is a way to mitigate those unpopular negative impacts. You know, you can build grade separations. They're expensive, but you can do it. So I think more intensification and better transit, a little bit unpopular, but critically important.
Absolutely. Yes. Joanna, I'd like to have you tackle that question from a private sector perspective. What is unnecessary, sure, but sometimes unpopular?
Well, perhaps not publicly unpopular. In fact, I think it might be, it's going to be unpopular with certain people. But, you know, speaking to Mike's comments with respect to building more transit, we have to get better at it. Because right now we're still kind of in our infancy, honestly, when it comes to delivery. And we're not as efficient, we're not as fast as I think everyone would like. You know, the Eglinton Crosstown is remarkably disruptive. We've literally done abdominal surgery on the city of Toronto by opening up all this huge corridor and disrupting it. But to reduce the impact, to reduce you know, the longevity of the construction period, there's particular things that we need to do to make that work better. And one of the biggest ones that I deal with all the time is utilities. And it sounds so mundane and it's so, you know, trite, possibly when you're talking about delivery of these big projects. But all this underground infrastructure causes us huge delays in trying to get it moved, relocated, redesigned, and get the attention of all these big companies. There's one jurisdiction, I can't recall who it is, that mandates that utility companies get their stuff out of the way of a transit project within 2 years. They're given a notice, they're told, get it out of the way, don't care what you have to do, just get it done. And it's government mandated. And there's penalties if those utility companies don't do that. And that gives certainty to the builders that this stuff will be out of the way in time in order to get the project delivered. You can imagine how popular that would be with the utility companies. But at the end of the day, we need to get their attention and need to get focused attention on doing these utility relocations on time to really support this transit expansion. So that's something that I've thought about a lot over the last 10 years. And, you know, there's been some incremental change happening at the province, but I'm not seeing the bold move to make it work.
Well, certainly with utilities related projects, there isn't ever a ribbon cutting ceremony the way transportation projects have that. So certainly unpopular, but very necessary.
Exactly.
Thanks, Joanna. Jeff, let me turn to you. Unnecessary, but very much needed or unpopular.
Yeah, so Mike talked about high-speed rail, and I want to pick up on that. So imagine for a moment that you are anywhere in Southwestern Ontario and you want to travel anywhere in the world. One path is that you get in your private car and you drive to Pearson Airport and you fly anywhere in the world. The other path is that we have a high-speed rail connection that connects Quebec City through Montreal to Ottawa, to Toronto, to Windsor, to Niagara Falls. And this allows for complete mobility throughout the southwestern Ontario and connects to Pearson Airport. So by extension, allows you to travel anywhere in the world, with the first leg of that trip being a high-speed rail. And there's parts of the world where that first leg of the trip is already integrated into the airline fare. So if I want to fly from Newark, New Jersey, and I start in Philadelphia, I get on Amtrak and I go to Newark Airport as part of my continental flight ticket around the world. And I check baggage at the Amtrak, so I never have to carry my bags onto the plane. Now that system works if there is a whole set of conditions that are in place. And here's where the idea gets bold. It's going to cost about $60 million per kilometer to build high-speed rail. So let's start with 500 kilometers. So we're talking about $30 billion. Where is the province of Ontario going to get $30 billion? Or where is the federal government going to get $30 billion to build this system? And the answer is easy. The answer is on Highway 401. This is immediately the alternative to high-speed rail. It is immediately the alternative. I'll just say that there's 85 flights a day that leave Pearson Airport that go shorter distances than 500 kilometers. So the airport is another pathway where we can find this money. But suppose everyone who traveled on Highway 401 paid a 2-cent electronically captured toll. We would have sufficient revenue to pay for our high-speed rail system in very short order. And the one thing I would argue is that we have to build the high-speed rail system first, give people that alternative, use public funds to create that, create a convenient, efficient system that is lower carbon. And then once that alternative exists, you can begin to ratchet up the price on what is underpriced right now, Highway 401 travel. And we wouldn't be building 8 and 12 lanes approaching the region of Waterloo to accommodate a short-term traffic congestion problem that overnight is empty again and becomes totally ineffective. Now, where the project gets even bolder is this. I would suggest that the only way that high-speed rail system works is if you have high-quality public transport that connects to the central city stations throughout southwestern Ontario. So in Kingston and in Ottawa, we should have the connections to the high-speed rail system. In the region of Waterloo, we already do have that connection. In London, we should be building this out. In Windsor, we should be building that connection. In Niagara Falls, we should make sure the connection's there and that you can connect to the same system that will ultimately be built in the US. And how do we afford that in the cities? Easy. We price parking. We price parking in our central cores. And if we actually price the actual cost associated with parking in our central cores, we could again generate the revenue to build LRT systems or the right transit system for each of these communities to integrate this. So we're talking about a fully electrified, fully public, high-speed rail intercity system that is integrated with local systems that allow you to connect throughout the region without ever using your car, and allows you to go internationally because you've made the same connection. I'll just say that when high-speed rail was built in France, there are no longer any flights that go shorter than 400 kilometers in France anywhere, because the high-speed rail network makes those flights obsolete. So there's a bold vision where we as a society decide that this is our future, an electric mobility created with high-speed rail, with integrated transit systems. We pay for it. Maybe it's $100 billion. We pay for that over the next 25 years. And when the system incrementally comes in place, we charge the alternative modes that are less effective, more polluting, less efficient, and we begin to recover the revenue that the public investment has made.
Absolutely. You just created a summary for the talk. And,
Sorry.
And that's absolutely wonderful how you've captured all these thoughts together to let us know exactly what is possible beyond the status quo and beyond what we know today. It's about 10 to the hour, and there's actually quite a lot of questions that have come through, and I want to save time for that. So I actually would like to just take an opportunity right now just to reflect on all your responses to the questions that started off by having the landscape, where the changes are at, and a future outlook. And that brings us full circle. And some of what you mentioned was a lot of transformational change, not necessarily focused on building more and more, but really tapping into human behaviors, really working with some of the incentives and the mechanisms that we have beyond engineering. You talked about intensification, transit, utilities, high-speed rail, and bolder moves. And it's the decisions that we make today in cities will far outlive us. And therefore we have a responsibility, but we as engineers also have the data. So those that have the knowledge also have the responsibility to act. I hope I did it a little bit of justice as a summary to our talk. And I'd like to take the opportunity right now to just scan some of the questions and share some of those with you. And feel free to jump in to respond to any of the questions as I share them with you. So let me start. Mike, I think this one's for you. The region of Waterloo's 2018 Transportation Master Plan, despite all its proposed transit and active transportation improvements, still has 68% automobile mode share target by 2041 in the region. So the question is, do you think our current planning visions and priorities are aggressive enough given the current climate crisis?
Since I'm no longer working for the region of Waterloo, my answer is they're probably not. They're probably not aggressive enough. So I'll just start with that. They're probably not aggressive enough. They probably need to be more aggressive. Having said that, change does take some time, and especially where we need physical infrastructure, it takes a disappointingly long time to build. In our case, the LRT was about, it was conceived of decades ago. It was in the region's first official plan back in the 70s, this concept of a central transportation corridor. But in terms of really making it real, it was probably a 15-year from concept through to completion, which, it sounds like a very long time, but in the scheme of large-scale transit projects, it's actually not bad. So all I'm saying is, yes, we probably need more aggressive targets. It's very, very challenging both to put in place the infrastructure and to create and to change people's behavior, because that's what's needed is behavioral change, right? And so there's a lot of forces working against that behavioral change. There's a lot of forces like inertia that reinforces the status quo. So until we can provide really convenient alternatives for people to get around, they're not likely to change their behavior. So, I think the pandemic showed we can close roads quickly, we can create bike lanes quickly. Are people changing their behavior? That remains to be seen, and there may need to be other triggers and signals. Jeff's talked a lot about pricing signals. I think that is one way that's going to be really critically important to change people's behavior, going forward. So yeah, we probably need more aggressive targets. It's a real challenge to put in place the infrastructure and change the behavior to meet those targets.
Thanks for that, Mike. Jeff, you touched upon a bit of the economics and the financial incentives. So perhaps this question, you could take this on. So making transit free is interesting. How would you compare the cost of a people kilometer of movement subsidy on roads versus transit, and how do those subsidies compare?
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot of research in that area, and the transit system, it's a little bit easier to look at. The normal number is, I think Mike might know better than I do, but we recover about 40% of our operating costs on public transport, something like that. So for every dollar that is spent on public transit, 60 of it comes from property taxes, 60 cents comes from property taxes, 40% comes from the user. And the data are not dissimilar for roads. The problem with roads measurements is what all is included, because if you start thinking about winter maintenance, and you start thinking about repaving, and if you think about reconstruction, the timelines in the infrastructure costs are there. And then if you start thinking about the carbon production, then again, what's the subsidy associated with the carbon production? If you talk about water quality in terms of the runoff that comes from roadways, if you were to test the water quality around the 401 after we haven't had a rainstorm for a few weeks, you would see that it's pretty poor water quality that's coming. So what all is included in those subsidies is a really difficult question. But certainly we are on par in terms of what the public is actually paying for our transportation modes. Certainly users are not paying the full price of any transportation mode, and that's true across all. And I think if we got the prices a little bit better, we would see, or if we at least made more public and more visible what the prices were, the public would have a better chance of understanding how their mode choices, their decisions were influencing public budgets.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Joanna, you're right in the thick of building transit at the moment. So I think this question could very well be yours. The question here is, they hear very little about accessibility. And if we want to move beyond just work trips, then we must address the ease of access. So forget the kids. They're asking in 2030, almost all baby boomers will have retired and not all of them will be able to climb those subway stairs. And so that's just one example, but could you speak to accessibility generally?
So accessibility, I mean, certainly we've gotten much better in terms of designing for accessibility, but often it's that last kilometer to a rapid transit station that really creates a barrier for anyone with any sort of accessibility or mobility problem. We have Wheel-Trans. It's okay. It isn't ideal. And there may well be new technologies like the automated vehicles that might provide a better way to get people in onto the main part of the system. Our vehicles now are far better, but I went through a period of time when I had knee surgery and I couldn't walk around very easily. It made me very conscious of all the barriers that are in the way of people who have any sort of mobility issue, and even cognitive issues as well. We have to do a much better job. There has to be more investment in making the systems available to the broader population. And that's where we bring in the equity lens into looking at transportation. We can't just assume that everybody can walk and bike, period. We cannot make that assumption. We have to look at the broader community that public transportation is going to be serving. And I would say equity is something that we're looking at, but I'm not sure we're there yet. I really am not sure we're there yet. But there needs to be money spent on the old part of the system that just isn't accessible. The new parts of the system, yes, they are. But it's still that last connecting piece from where you live and where you're going that's really going to be critical for us to take a much harder look at and work with those communities to make sure that we're doing the right thing that's going to help them.
Thanks, Joanna. And I think that's a good segue, because you spoke about the older systems into this question. And this is really a question for all of you. London, New York, and Paris built their subway infrastructures 50 to 100 years ago, and it works today to move the masses. And can you predict out 50 to 100 years with respect to the Greater Golden Horseshoe with old subway technologies?
Well, the fact of the matter is I used to work for TTC, and really at the end of the day, we're starting to see the transformation in the old parts of the subway system now, where we're upgrading signaling systems. We're upgrading with new vehicles. So we're having to do upgrades, but the foundational parts of the system, the tunnels and the stations, those are the foundation, and those still exist, and we retrofit them with this new technology. And we'll continue to see that evolution happening. And that's really what's happened in these other big cities, where they have done that transformation and they have done upgrades and they have changed vehicles, and they've added new features like extra exits, and they've added new safety systems, all of that has happened. We'll see the same thing happening here.
Maybe I could just say a little bit about the old technology, because the old technology is very new. You know, the idea that we can move masses of people, if you look at a 10-car TTC or an 8-car TTC train, you're really talking about moving 1,800 people with a single vehicle, a single transit unit. In some cases, still we have a driver, but the ability to automate that system. I mean, we're talking a lot about automatic vehicles, but we've had automatic vehicles. Paris opened the Meteor line in 1988, I think. That was an automated rail system, and so we don't need drivers. Singapore, Seoul, they all have automated systems. And rail, from an energy intensity point of view, is singly the best system that we can operate. The rolling resistance is absolutely near to zero. It regeneratively brakes. And so all of this old technology has all the attributes that we would want in a new system. And that's why rail continues to dominate in the public transport system. It's not to say that buses aren't convenient on streets and so on. They don't have a role to play. But this isn't old technology. This is the attributes. And as Joanna was saying, we're now running communication-based train control, where we use Wi-Fi systems so trains talk to each other and know exactly not only where they are, but whether they're accelerating or braking and how far apart they are. And so we can have trains falling closer and closer. So we're talking now 100-second headways on the TTC, not 3 minutes under the old block system. So I think that to portray the rail system as an old technology is not doing it justice, because it's a series of, if you really look at the attributes associated with rail technology, they're all what we would design today if we were starting over.
And I might come at it slightly differently. I think, the question was like looking ahead to the greater Golden Horseshoe, 50, 100 years. I think you could imagine a network of rapid transit systems serving the different communities in the greater Golden Horseshoe. And I think what you would do is different communities would have different types of technology appropriate to their density and appropriate to their urban form. So in some places, you need and want subways. In other places, surface light rail. So the examples were Paris, London, and somewhere else. But you look at some of the smaller centers in Europe, serviced by high-speed rail between cities and within the city, light rail transit, trams, rarely buses, fixed transit systems, tailored to the local circumstances. So I think you could easily imagine a network spanning the whole greater Golden Horseshoe with high-speed rail between the urban centers and really good rapid transit, LRT, maybe some bus rapid transit, serving individual cities. And that's totally conceivable. The other thing that we haven't talked a lot about is the interplay between the transportation infrastructure and the form of development. Because what we're seeing in Waterloo Region is exactly as anticipated, which is having built the LRT, we're seeing significant intensification and development around the station areas and along the corridors. So it's not just fitting the transit system into the existing urban form, it's using the transportation system to shape the kind of urban form that you want in the future.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Joanna and Jeff. I mean, you all three of you tackled that question, contrasting also the historical perspective and the future outlook as well. I recognize it's 5 past the hour and we've got a little bit over, and you've been very generous with your time for sticking around. We do have time for one more question. And because it is one that also contrasts historical perspective and gives the future, let's have that as our final question before we wrap up. So this one is from Scott Morris. 100 years ago, many communities had electric transit via streetcars and interurban railways, and the automobile changed all this. Are there lessons of the planning practices of a century ago? Could that still be used today?
I'm eager to answer that one. I think, Nadine, if you look back to that mindset, if you look at the historical evolution, the car sort of came to be at late 20s and then the early 30s. And there was this sort of growth of automobile ownership. And then, of course, the wars came and that suppressed the ownership of autos and really resulted in a delay. And we had a sort of a resurgence of transit in that period. But the mindset of planners in the post-war period were really that we were going to build housing for all of our returning GIs. There was going to be an explosion of population, which there was, the baby boomers, and we had to create housing for those, and we had to build out. And there was really one model that was envisioned, and that was the suburban subdivision that was accessed by car, and that was going to be the future of development. And there were very few alternatives that were put in place at that time. And as a result, what you see places now that are only accessible by car. And this concept of auto dominance has really become problematic. And I think the lesson is, and you know, I've talked a lot about transit and high-speed rail, we all have. And I think what's important is that we're not talking about this exclusively. We're talking about creating a composition of mobility alternatives that includes e-scooters and e-bikes and bicycles and walking and accessibility modes and transit and the auto when it's the appropriate thing for us to do. And we're talking about trying to create really a very intermodal but purposefully designed intermodal kind of system that allows us to achieve our mobility objectives, but do it without a single reliance on one system. And I think that's the planning lesson that we have to take away, is that there's not a one size fits all land use pattern, and there's not a one size fits all transportation pattern. We need to be diverse, and we need to be offering choices and alternatives. And I would argue we need to price them correctly. I'll just throw that last one in.
Excellent. So Joanna, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jeff is 100% correct. Like, there can't be one solution here, but we also have to change we have to really influence the development community, because at the end of the day, you know, the path of least resistance is to build another condo and not to build a complete community. And you know, it really takes some vision to create more of a complete community when some of these big transformations are happening. And we're starting to see some real vision coming into land development. And you know, my favorite example, of course, is at the Vaughan Metropolitan Center, where we've gone from, you know, big box retail to this really quite phenomenal new urban center in a matter of less than 10 years. And that's the type of community development where you have daycare, where you have a public library and a YMCA, and you have shopping, and you have the transit hub, and you have a public park. All of those things are part of what makes these new developments around transit work and work well. And they can't just be, you know, a bunch of condos sitting at a transit station. That isn't acceptable any longer. So I think we really need to start pushing for a much better, bigger vision for some of these transformations that are going to take place.
Thanks, Joanna.
And I might just really quickly reinforce, you know, what Jeff and Joanna said. I think, you know, what we're trying to do is create way more viable options for people, both viable options in terms of where they live and viable options in terms of how they get around. And if you think back 20, 30 years, if I think back, you know, 20 years in Waterloo region, and it was similar to many other places, like really, if you wanted to buy a place to live, I'm gonna say buy a place to live, your only choice was buy a house in a brand new subdivision, largely. That has shifted dramatically over the last 20, 30 years, and I think needs to continue to shift. Similarly, 20 years ago in Waterloo region, you needed a car to get around. Like, it was very difficult. You couldn't take public transit between Kitchener and Cambridge. You know, that's how bad it was. So you needed a car to get around. You know, fast forward 20 plus years, you can live comfortably in Kitchener-Waterloo, the region of Waterloo, without a car. We've created more choices for people, more options that are viable for people. And I think we got to accelerate that, like, you know, an order of magnitude. We got to accelerate the pace of that and the scale of it. But, you know, I think it's providing choice. And I totally agree with Jeff, pricing things appropriately, giving people signals that's going to create the behavioral change that we need and want.
Absolutely. It's certainly not just about the engineering. It's the behavioral changes. It's the behavioral economics. It's really sometimes just the economics. And so let me say thanks for staying a little bit over time, and thanks for our audience for going a little bit over. I want to thank our panelists for participating in today's transformation. I want to personally thank you for being bold, for being transformational, and for being truly inspirational. This past hour has been an hour of inspiration into what is possible in the future. And you make it sound like it's possible because it's been done. You showed us how the groundwork has already been done, so it's not too far-fetched into the future. And I also want to thank the organizers, Rachel, Gosha, Carrie, for making this possible, for bringing us together, and for the audience and the wonderful questions that we didn't have time to get through all of them, but hopefully we can have a copy of all these questions and really use them as food for thought going forward. And let me say that the next sessions of these Alumni Speaker Series will return in the new year. And there's a survey that goes out, so please complete the feedback survey. And that's going to be available when today's session ends, so we can know the topics that you'd like to hear about in the future. And in the next few days, everyone who registered will receive an email, a link to today's session to watch the recorded video on YouTube. And feel free to share it with your friends. And with that, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye for now.